And now that we've learned that, we can start moving, rotating, and scaling things. If you want to move something, the shortcut for that is the G. If I just press G now, then you will see that I have my dice in my hand, so to speak. Right-click here again to undo, and left-click to confirm or lock the object into place, so to speak. Now I'll look at the bottom left here too. We've moved the cube by these values on all three axes. Here we can now enter values again if we would want to. But now we want to move objects specifically on axis. We don't want to press G and move the object on all three axes at the same time, as I will again be showing in the Object's Properties panel. No, right now we only want to move it on the x-axis, the y-axis, or the z-axis, for example. It's a pretty intuitive shortcut. First you press the G and then, for example, X for the x-axis, and now we can drag the mouse here again, and the object only moves on the x-axis. Same goes for the y, and same goes for the z, so it's G and y, G and z, etc. So what if we want to move the object on an axis by a specific value? That too is very intuitive. In Blender, measurements are made using the metric system. Now, if we say we want to move the cube 2 meters on the x-axis, positive 2 meters, then we're going to type gx and 2. And now the cube shifted exactly 2 meters on the x-axis in the positive direction, meaning our direction. But if you look at this input field in the top left, you can also see what happens if I press G here, for example. And when I press X, it goes to the x-axis, Y to the y-axis, Z to the z-axis. That way I can change the movement of the axes even after pressing G. However, it's very important to understand that you can only transform on one axis at the time. So for example, when you're moving on the x-axis, you cannot say, hey, now I want to work on the z-axis, because then the block will just snap right back into place and you're back where you were before. So if you want to do that, you first have to move it on the x-axis, then switch, and then move it on the z-axis. However, if we now want to move our cube on the ground but want to move it freely, then this means we want to move the cube on the x and the y-axis at the same time. So to get the cube's level with the ground, we can press GZ1, because the cube is 2 meters tall. Okay, we have to put in a little more ground for some visual representation, so we're going to add a plane, and now we can set the plane to say 20 meters, something like that. Now we want to move this cube on the x and the y-axis, but not on the z-axis. This means that we want to move the cube freely on the floor. And we can now do that by pressing G and then pressing Shift Z. So we're moving now on two axes other than the z-axis, and now you'll see that we are actually doing it. We can move the cube completely freely on these two axes, and now we won't move on the z-axis. Again, this could be seen in the Object Properties panel on the right. The same applies to the other axis, of course. If I go here now and press Shift Y, then you will see that I'm now moving the object in the plane, so to speak, from the z and the x-axis, and I can move it freely there. The same goes for the x-axis, of course. This is also very important to understand. If I go now and press Shift Z, for that matter, to be able to freely move the object only on the X and the Y axis, it's the equivalent of going to top view or bottom view. If I go into the top view now, you'll see that the Z axis is locked to a meter. If I just press G and move the thing freely, you'll see that the Z axis stays locked too. The same applies to the bottom view, of course. That is, any view looking parallel to a selected axis, in this case the Z axis, eliminates free movement on that axis. So that means that if I now look here from the left, then we can look at our views in such a way that we look at our sin parallel to the x-axis, and then the movement on the x-axis is eliminated. The movement on the y-axis is then eliminated from those in the front view, which means you can save yourself the whole G-Shift-Z thing. Rather, go to the pie menu, go to the top view, and then the whole thing is much easier. But we don't just want to move the objects, we also want to rotate them. The hotkey for that is R, which has everything to do with what we're trying to achieve here: rotation. However, as you can see, a problem occurs, and that is that we are very uncontrolled right now. We are now rotating on all possible axes, and you can see that again in the Object Properties panel on the right. Now, for example, I want to press RX, and then it will only rotate on the X-axis, so RY on the Y-axis and RZ on the Z-axis, etc. The number input we applied with the distance applies here as well. So if you want to move something 45 degrees on the Z-axis, you press RZ45, and there you go. You now moved your object 45 degrees on the z-axis. A huge element in this movement is the pivot point, which is the orange dot in the middle. This means that if I press R here, it will always turn in such a way that the point in the middle remains the same. So can we change this pivot point? Yes, we can. First, we gotta see what the pivot point is. The pivot point is the object's origin, which by default is always in the center of an object's geometry. Ergo, the arithmetic center of the room, so to speak. If you want to change the pivot point, it's easy to do by pressing Tab. You are now in the so-called editing mode, and if you move the object, you will see that you can move the object independently of the pivot point. The object's origin stays the same, and you can move the object independently of the pivot point. If you are in object mode, this is not the case. In the object mode, the origin is also moved, which means that you can now move your object against the pivot point and accordingly set the pivot point the way it wants. That means I want to enter GY1 and GZ1 here, for example, and now the pivot point is down here. Because if we rotate now, I will see how the pivot point influences the rotation of our cube quite significantly. When you move an object, the pivot point does not have a lot of influence, but when you turn an object or scale it, it really does. Scaling can be done with the hotkey S. If you press it, you can first make your cube bigger and smaller on all axes at the same time. And you will already see here that if I make this very small, and then all the points will get closer and closer to the pivot point, so the object gets closer to the origin. Now, if we wanted to move the origin of the object back to the center of the cube, we could do that by right-clicking now and saying set volume to the center of mass. With the cube, it doesn't make much of a difference. It's very simple geometry. With other objects, especially with text, for example, this can make a huge difference, sometimes deviating by half a meter. But in general, mass of volume is exactly what you want if you mean the center of the geometry. Now, if we want to put the cube back into the exact center of the world, so to speak, then we can go to the right-hand panel and put 0, 0, 0 and the location markers at X, Y, and Z. You can do this though, but you don't have to, because there is a so-called snap menu for all these actions. You can open it by pressing Shift S, and there you will see all the options that you might need in this specific situation. Also, you will see a lot of mention of the word cursor, but what is the cursor? The cursor is this circle, this white-red circle with this crosshair in the middle, which you can also move by taking this cursor tool here and then left-clicking. That way you have it in your own hand. If you now select your selection tool again, what you need to be able to select things, also very important, then you select the cube, then press Shift S. And now you can say you want to move the cube as your selection to the cursor. So you move the object to your 3D cursor. And as you can see here, once again, what we actually moved to the cursor is the object's origin. That means that if our object origin is in a place where we don't like it to be, it will still move there. So if we move the object origin, say to the left side of the cube, for example, we press Shift S and then 8 for selection to cursor, it will move the object accordingly. If we now right click on our object, you will also see other options for set origin. For example, origin to 3D cursor, which is very interesting in any case. That means that we can very quickly and in a very controlled manner move our origin of this cube to the point up here. That means we can now go into the edit mode, select this point, press Shift S, and then select selection to cursor, and now right click origin to 3D cursor. And now we have our origin. This means that if we now scale or rotate, everything revolves around this point. And in order to stretch our cube to make it larger, wider, or higher, we can just select an axis first, and then again, for example, press S, X, and then our cube becomes longer, or S and Y, and it becomes wider, or S and Z, and it becomes higher. And when you press S, Shift, and Z, it will become larger and wider, but not higher. And if you press S, Shift, and X, it will become wider and higher, but not longer.